I woke up in the ICU with a shattered pelvis and a terrifying emptiness in my womb. My premature newborn was alone. When the hospital called my mother, she refused to come. She was busy, but she forgot about Grandpa Theodore, and his one call ignited a brutal war. My name is Jessica. If you grew up as the scapegoat in a toxic family system, you already know the heavy, invisible chains I dragged around for 28 years. My mother, Barbara, was a master of psychological warfare. To the outside world, she was a dedicated PTA mom, a highly successful real estate agent with a blinding, perfect smile, and a pillar of our suburban community in Oak Brook. Behind closed doors, however, she was a woman obsessed with one single thing: my older brother, Brandon. Brandon was the undisputed golden child. In Barbara's eyes, he could do no wrong, and the sun rose and set on his shoulders. When he crashed 3 different cars before the age of 20, Barbara blamed the roads, the weather, and the alignment of the tires. When he dropped out of a very expensive private college, it was because the professors didn't possess the intellect to understand his genius. He lived rent-free in a condo she owned, bouncing between half-baked startup ideas. Meanwhile, I existed in the shadows. I paid my own way through the state university, working double shifts at a local diner until my feet bled, and graduating with honors in graphic design. My mother's only comment at my college graduation was that my gown made me look a bit wide in the hips. I learned early on to survive by expecting absolutely nothing from her. I built a life independent of her approval. Then I met my husband, Caleb. Caleb is a software engineer with the kindest eyes and a family that actually likes each other. He was my anchor, teaching me what unconditional love actually looked like. When we got married, we had a beautiful, modest ceremony in a local botanical garden. Barbara showed up 30 minutes late, wearing a white, floor-length lace gown. I let it go because that's what you do when you're conditioned to keep the peace. You swallow the poison and smile for the photos. The real fractures in our already fragile relationship began when Caleb and I discovered we were expecting our first child. I was 28, thrilled, and terrified when I called Barbara to share the news, hoping for once to hear joy in her voice. There was a long, suffocating pause on the line. "Well," she sighed heavily, "I suppose that's nice. But you know Brandon is officially proposing to Tiffany next month. This is really going to steal his thunder, Jessica. Couldn't you have timed this better? Tiffany is going to be incredibly stressed out by this." I hung up the phone and cried on the cold bathroom floor. Caleb held me, whispering that we didn't need her, that our baby would have more than enough love from the people who actually mattered. And we did. But there's a primal, broken part of a daughter that always craves her mother's warmth, especially when she's about to step into motherhood herself. As my pregnancy progressed, Barbara's indifference morphed into blatant hostility. Brandon and Tiffany's wedding planning had consumed her entirely. Tiffany was a high-maintenance nightmare who demanded a $50,000 destination-style wedding in the city, and Barbara, desperate to keep her golden boy happy, was draining her savings and maxing out credit cards to fund it. She completely ignored my pregnancy milestones. I had a severe case of hyperemesis gravidarum in my second trimester, throwing up so violently that I landed in the ER twice for intravenous dehydration. When Caleb called her to see if she could just sit with me for 2 hours while he gave a crucial work presentation, Barbara actually laughed. "I'm at the florist, Caleb," she scoffed over the phone. "Peonies are out of season, and Tiffany is having a total meltdown about the centerpieces. Jessica just has morning sickness. She needs to stop being so dramatic and drink some ginger ale." That was the day my grandfather, Theodore, officially stepped in. Theodore was my late father's dad. He was a retired commercial architect, a man made of steel, worn leather, and quiet dignity. He had always kept his distance from Barbara after my dad passed away, deeply disgusted by her narcissism and financial irresponsibility. But he kept a close, protective eye on me. When he heard I was in the hospital, he drove 2 hours from his lake cabin, sat by my bed in silence, fed me ice chips, and glared terrifyingly at any nurse who spoke too loudly. "You belong to my blood, Jessie. Grandpa Theodore told me in his deep, gravelly voice, holding my frail hand. Don't you ever beg for scraps from a table where you don't belong. Let her have her circus. You focus on your own family now. I nodded, tears stinging my eyes, feeling safe for the first time in weeks. I didn't know then that Grandpa Theodore's words were a prophecy. I didn't know that just a few months later, I would be fighting for my life in a pile of crushed steel, and my mother would leave my baby to the wolves. It was a Tuesday afternoon in late November. I was exactly 34 weeks pregnant. Caleb was in Seattle for a 3-day tech conference. His first time leaving my side since the brutal complications early in my pregnancy. I was driving home from a routine prenatal checkup. The sky was a bruised purple, threatening freezing rain, but the heater in my Honda was blasting. I was listening to an audiobook, feeling a rare moment of absolute, perfect peace. The doctor had just told me our little girl was perfectly healthy, growing strong. We had finally settled on a name. Lily. I was crossing the major intersection at Route 47. I had the solid green light. I didn't even see the massive F-150 truck run the red light until it was inches from my door. The impact sounded like a bomb detonating inside my skull. The world violently spun into a kaleidoscope of shattered safety glass, screaming metal, and crushing, unimaginable force. I remember the smell of the deployed airbags, dusty, burnt, and chemical, and a searing, blinding agony radiating through my lower half. My car was T-boned on the driver's side, crushed inward like a discarded aluminum can. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move my legs. But through the fading edges of my consciousness, as the sirens began to wail in the distance, all I could focus on was the terrifying stillness in my belly. My baby. I tried to choke out to the frantic faces peering through my shattered window. Please, check on my baby. Then, everything went black. I woke up to a nightmare of sensory overload. The harsh, sterile fluorescent lights of the intensive care unit stung my retinas. A tube was being carefully removed from my throat. Machines were beeping frantically, and the lower half of my body felt like it was encased in a block of concrete that was actively on fire. I panicked, thrashing my arms against the IV lines. A nurse rushed to my side. She had a kind, tired face framed by dark blue scrubs. Jessica? Jessica, honey, look at me. Stay still. Squeeze my hand. I'm Nurse Sophia. I squeezed with all the weak strength I had left. My eyes wild, frantically pointing to my stomach. It was flat, covered in thick white bandages, but terribly, undeniably flat. Sophia's eyes softened with immediate, heavy empathy. Breathe, Jessica. The baby is alive. You had to have an emergency C-section the second you arrived. She's small. She's in the NICU, but she's a fighter. You, on the other hand, have a shattered pelvis, 2 broken ribs, and massive internal bleeding. You just got out of a 6-hour trauma surgery. Relief washed over me. So potent and overwhelming it felt like a narcotic. Lily was alive. But as the heavy anesthesia haze lifted slightly, the cold reality of the situation crashed down. Where was Caleb? Sophia explained that they had reached Caleb's hotel, but he was currently on a desperately rebooked flight back. He was stuck in the air, somewhere over the Midwest, completely unreachable for at least another 3 hours. Jessica, Nurse Sophia's tone shifted, becoming hesitant and tight. We had to call your emergency contact while you were in surgery. We needed immediate medical consent for the baby. Because she was premature and suffered trauma in the crash, she needed an emergency blood transfusion and a temporary medical proxy since your husband was unreachable and we weren't sure you were going to make it. My heart plummeted. My emergency contact. Years ago, long before Caleb, I had put my mother, Barbara, on my master medical files at this specific hospital network, and I had never thought to update it. You called my mother, I rasped out, my throat raw and bleeding from the intubation tube. Yes, Sophia said, looking deeply uncomfortable, avoiding my direct gaze. Well, we told her you were in a critical car accident. We told her your baby was delivered prematurely. was fighting in the NICU and needed immediate consent forms signed. We told her she needed to get here right now to take proxy custody, or we would have to involve an emergency state social worker. What did she say? I whispered. The heart monitor next to me began to ping faster, betraying my rising panic. Sophia looked away for a second, a flicker of genuine, unprofessional anger crossing her features. She told the charge nurse that she was currently at Tiffany's final wedding dress fitting in the city. She said, and I quote, "I cannot leave this right now. This wedding is in 2 weeks and we are dealing with a crisis with the veil. Put the kid in the nursery or call a social worker. I don't care. Don't bother me with this today. Jessica always ruins everything." And then she hung up on us. The silence in the ICU room was deafening. Even the rhythmic whoosh of the machines seemed to hold their breath. My own mother. I was bleeding out on an operating table. My premature daughter was fighting for her life in a plastic box, and my mother refused to leave a dress fitting. She had abandoned us to the state. Sophia confirmed that a CPS social worker had actually been dispatched and was currently sitting in the NICU as Lily's temporary medical proxy. I was utterly, completely alone in the worst moment of my life. A cold, dark numbness spread through my veins, freezing over the shattered pieces of my heart. The sadness vanished, instantly vaporized by a blinding, white-hot rage. "Nurse, Sophia," I croaked, my voice shaking with a terrifying, newly forged strength. "Can you get my phone? Or bring me a hospital phone? You really need to rest, Jessica. Your blood pressure. Please," I begged, grabbing her wrist with a desperate grip. "I need to make one call. Not to her. Never to her. Again." She nodded softly, bringing me the receiver of the landline next to the bed. My fingers trembled violently as I dialed a number I had memorized since childhood. It rang 3 times. "Yeah," the gruff voice answered. "Grandpa Teddy," I sobbed, the dam finally breaking. "It's Jessie." "Jessie? Honey, what's wrong? You sound terrible." "I was in a bad crash. They had to take the baby early. I'm in the ICU at St. Jude's. Caleb's on a plane and can't be reached." I gasped for air, the pain in my broken ribs screaming at me. "The hospital called Barbara to come be the baby's proxy. She refused. Grandpa, she said she was at Tiffany's dress fitting. They had to call a state worker. My baby is alone." The silence on the other end of the line was entirely different from Barbara's. Barbara's silence was always a void of empathy. Grandpa Theodore's silence was the terrifying, heavy quiet right before a Category 5 hurricane makes landfall. "A state worker," he repeated. His voice had dropped an octave, sounding like grinding stones. "Yes. And your mother hung up on the hospital while you were in surgery?" "Yes." "Listen to me, Jessica," Grandpa Theodore said, and I could hear the sharp jingle of his heavy truck keys in the background. "I am 30 minutes away. I am coming. I will rip those papers from the social worker and sign whatever needs to be signed. I will sit by that baby's incubator, and then I will sit by your bed until Caleb gets there." "Thank you," I wept, gripping the phone like a lifeline. "And Jessie?" "Yes, Grandpa. When you heal from this," he said, his voice laced with a lethal, icy promise that sent shivers down my spine. "We are going to take everything from her. Do you understand me? Absolutely everything." "I understand," I whispered. Grandpa Theodore hung up. The wheels of karma hadn't just been set in motion. They had been strapped to a runaway freight train. And my mother was standing right on the tracks, completely oblivious. True to his word, Grandpa Theodore arrived at St. Jude's Hospital in exactly 28 minutes. I didn't see it happen, but Nurse Sophia later described his entrance to me with a look of absolute reverence. She said he didn't walk into the ICU. He parted it, like the Red Sea. He strode in wearing his heavy leather work boots and a faded flannel jacket, carrying a battered leather briefcase that contained every piece of legal identification, birth certificate, and family trust documentation he had amassed over 60 years. He found the CPS social worker, a frazzled woman named Mrs. Higgins, sitting outside the NICU doors. He didn't yell. He didn't cause a scene. He simply sat down beside her, opened his briefcase, and legally dismantled the state's temporary custody in under 15 minutes. He established himself as Lily's blood relative and emergency proxy, signing the surgical consent forms with a steady, furious hand. Then, he came to my room. I was drifting in and out of a morphine haze, the pain in my pelvis throbbing with a dull, sickening rhythm. I felt a rough, warm hand encompass mine. I opened my eyes to see Grandpa Theodore sitting in the plastic chair beside my bed. His jaw was clenched so tight a muscle ticked near his ear, but his eyes were entirely focused on me. "She's safe, Jessie," he rumbled softly. "Lily is tiny, but she's breathing on her own. She has your stubborn chin. She is safe, and the state worker is gone." I let out a sob that rattled my broken ribs, the relief washing over me like a physical wave. "Thank you. Oh God, thank you." "Save your strength," he instructed, gently wiping a tear from my cheek with his thumb. Caleb's plane landed. "He's in a cab." When Caleb finally burst through the ICU doors an hour later, he looked like he had aged 10 years. His suit was rumpled, his face was pale and streaked with dried tears, and he was shaking violently. He collapsed by my bed, burying his face in my neck, sobbing uncontrollably. For the first time in my life, I felt truly held. Between Caleb's fierce love and Grandpa Theodore's unshakable protection, a fortified wall was being built around me, and Barbara was firmly on the outside. It took exactly 3 days for my mother to remember I existed. I had been moved from the ICU to a high-dependency trauma ward. I was wrapped in pelvic binders, hooked up to a terrifying array of monitors, and was just allowed to start drinking clear fluids. Caleb was down the hall in the NICU, reading a children's book to Lily through the plastic holes of her incubator. Grandpa Theodore was sitting by the window in my room, quietly reading a newspaper. The door swung open. In walked Barbara, looking like she had just stepped off the cover of a lifestyle magazine. Her hair was perfectly blown out. She wore a pristine beige cashmere sweater, and the diamond rings on her fingers caught the fluorescent hospital lights. In one hand, she held a large iced caramel macchiato. In the other, she held a single, pathetic, deflated mylar balloon that said "Get well soon" with a cartoon bear on it. She stopped at the foot of my bed, taking in the bruised, battered, broken mess of her daughter. Her nose wrinkled slightly, as if the smell of antiseptic offended her. "Well," she sighed dramatically, taking a sip of her iced coffee. "You always did know how to cause a scene, Jessica. Do you have any idea how much traffic I had to fight to get here? The Eisenhower was backed up for miles." She hadn't asked how I was. She hadn't asked if her granddaughter was alive. She didn't even notice Grandpa Theodore sitting quietly in the corner shadows. "You refused the hospital's call," I said. My voice was raspy, but it didn't shake. I looked at her, truly looking at her, and the last frayed string of my childhood attachment snapped. I felt nothing for her. Just cold, empty space. "Oh, please, don't start with the guilt trips." Barbara rolled her eyes, waving her manicured hand dismissively. The nurse who called was incredibly rude. I was in the middle of a major crisis. Tiffany's veil arrived, and the lace didn't match the bodice of the dress. It was a disaster. "I knew you were in a hospital surrounded by doctors. What exactly was I supposed to do?" "I'm not a surgeon, Jessica. You were supposed to be a mother," I said flatly. "They were going to hand Lily over to the state." "Well, they didn't, did they?" she snapped back, clearly annoyed that I wasn't dropping the subject. "Everything worked out. Honestly, you need to lower your stress levels. It's not good for your recovery. Anyway, I can only stay for a few minutes. Brandon and Tiffany are doing their cake tasting at 2, and I have to write the check." "Barbara." The voice came from the corner of the room. It was quiet, but it commanded the space like a gunshot. Barbara jumped, spilling a drop of her coffee on her pristine sweater. She whipped around to see Grandpa Theodore standing up. He folded his newspaper with agonizing slowness. He didn't look like an old man, he looked like an executioner, Theodore, she stammered, her fake confidence faltering for a fraction of a second. I didn't see you there. What are you doing here? My job, he replied, walking slowly toward the foot of the bed until he was standing directly in front of her. He towered over her. And yours? Excuse me? She bristled, trying to regain her footing. I am her mother. You have no right to. You lost the right to use that title 3 days ago when you left my great-granddaughter to the wolves so you could look at a piece of lace. Theodore interrupted, his voice never raised, which made it infinitely more terrifying. You are not a mother. You are an empty shell of a woman playing dress-up, and you are trespassing. Trespassing? This is a hospital, Theodore. I am family. You are nothing, Theodore said coldly. He pointed a thick, calloused finger at the door. Leave this room. Do not go near the NICU. If you take one step toward that baby, I will have security drag you out by your perfect hair. You are done here, Barbara. Barbara looked at me, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and fury, expecting me to intervene, expecting the trained, compliant scapegoat to beg for peace. Jessica, tell him to back off, she demanded. I looked her dead in the eye. You heard him. Get out. Her face flushed an ugly shade of magenta. She dropped the deflated balloon on the floor, turned on her heel, and stormed out of the room. That was the last time I saw her as a woman who held any power over me. The next 6 weeks were a grueling test of endurance. I was transferred to a rehabilitation center to learn how to walk again. My days were filled with agonizing physical therapy, tears of frustration, and the dull ache of healing bones. But the bright light at the end of the tunnel was Lily. At 5 weeks old, she officially graduated from the NICU. Caleb brought her to the rehab center, and holding her against my chest, feeling her tiny, steady heartbeat healed parts of me that the doctors couldn't touch. While I was fighting to rebuild my body, Grandpa Theodore was silently, methodically executing a masterclass in ruin. 2 weeks before Brandon and Tiffany's extravagant wedding, Caleb pushed my wheelchair up the ramp of our home. We were finally discharged. Grandpa Theodore was waiting for us in our living room. The fireplace was crackling, and there was a thick, manila envelope sitting on the coffee table. After we settled Lily into her bassinet, Theodore poured us both a cup of tea, sat down opposite us, and placed his hands on the envelope. I told you I would take everything from her, he said quietly, looking at me. And I meant it. I leaned forward, the pain in my pelvis momentarily forgotten. What did you do? Your mother has always lived beyond her means, Theodore began, his voice calm and analytical. She wanted the Oak Brook Country Club lifestyle without the income to support it. When your father died, he left a substantial trust. But he wasn't an idiot. He knew what she was. He made me the sole executor of that trust. She received a generous monthly stipend, but she couldn't touch the principal. I nodded. I knew about the trust, but I had never asked for a dime, preferring to make my own way. 5 years ago, Theodore continued, Brandon wanted that luxury condo. Barbara came to me, begging for the funds. I told her absolutely not. So, she got creative. Theodore opened the envelope and slid a stack of legal documents across the table. She used the monthly stipend to qualify for a massive mortgage on that condo, he explained. But she put it entirely in her own name, not Brandon's, to control him. But that wasn't enough to fund this ridiculous wedding. 2 months ago, she took out a $75,000 line of credit against the condo. How? Caleb asked, frowning. She doesn't have the equity or the income for that. She does if she forges my signature, Theodore said, the ice returning to his voice. She submitted a fraudulent document claiming she had full access to the trust's principal as collateral. The bank didn't verify it thoroughly enough. They just approved the credit. My jaw dropped. Grandpa. Yes, it is, Theodore agreed grimly. When you were lying in that hospital bed, and she was at that dress fitting, I made a few phone calls. I contacted the bank's fraud department. I provided them with the genuine trust documents and proved my signature was forged. They immediately froze her accounts and called in the loan. He leaned back, a dark satisfaction gleaming in his eyes. But I didn't stop there. Since the mortgage on the condo was heavily tied to the fraudulent credit line, the bank accelerated the mortgage. She has 30 days to pay it in full, or they foreclose. And because she used the fraudulent money to pay the wedding vendors, well, checks are bouncing all over the city. The trap had sprung. It was brilliant, ruthless, and entirely of Barbara's own making. The fallout was catastrophic and deeply public. 3 days later, the catering company for the wedding, a high-end vendor that required payment up front, was notified that Barbara's massive check had bounced due to frozen accounts. They cancelled the contract. The florist followed suit. The venue, a glamorous downtown hotel, demanded a wire transfer to keep the reservation. Barbara, cut off from her stolen lifeline, couldn't produce the money. When Tiffany realized that the $50,000 dream wedding was suddenly evaporating into thin air, and that her future husband was about to be evicted from his owned condo by a bank foreclosure, her true colors flew high and proud. She didn't stay to support Brandon. She packed her bags, threw her engagement ring on the kitchen counter, and left him, blocking both his and Barbara's numbers. The golden child's life shattered overnight. And who did he blame? Not himself. Not his gold-digging fiancée. He turned his rage entirely on Barbara. My phone rang on a Tuesday evening. I was sitting on the couch, rocking Lily, finally able to do so, without searing pain. The caller ID flashed my mother's name. I let it ring. Then came a frantic, desperate voicemail. I put it on speakerphone so Caleb could hear. Jessica. Barbara's voice was a frantic, hyperventilating mess, entirely stripped of its usual polished arrogance. Jessica, please pick up. Please. Theodore has lost his mind, he told the bank. They froze everything. Brandon is screaming at me. He won't even look at me. Tiffany is gone. They are taking the condo. I have nothing. Please. You have to talk to Theodore. You're the only one he listens to. Tell him to undo this. Tell him I'm sorry. I'll apologize for the hospital. I'll do whatever you want. Please, Jessie. I'm your mother. I listened to the message, feeling the weight of 28 years of neglect, gaslighting, and emotional abuse finally lift off my shoulders. She wasn't sorry she abandoned me. She was sorry she got caught in her own web of lies and lost her precious golden boy. Caleb looked at me, his eyes gentle but guarded. Do you want to call her back? I looked down at Lily, who was sleeping peacefully against my chest, her tiny fingers curled into a fist. I thought about the ICU. I thought about the cold, empty void where my mother's love was supposed to be. No, I said, reaching over and pressing the delete button on the voicemail. Then, I went into my settings and blocked her number permanently. She's not my mother. She's just somebody I used to know. Blocking my mother's phone number was the most terrifying and liberating physical action I had ever taken. For 28 years, I had been conditioned to believe that ignoring Barbara was a cardinal sin that would bring down the wrath of God. But as my phone screen went dark, the sky didn't fall. The earth didn't open up to swallow me. The only thing that happened was that the quiet, steady sound of my daughter's breathing filled the room, unbroken and peaceful. While I focused entirely on my recovery, Grandpa Theodore handled the messy, brutal execution of Barbara's financial and social demise. He didn't do it with malice, but with the cold, surgical precision of a man excising a tumor, because Barbara had forged Theodore's signature on the trust documents to secure the $75,000 line of credit. She had committed a severe felony. The bank's fraud department was prepared to hand the entire file over to the district attorney. Barbara was facing real, undeniable prison time. She panicked. Without Brandon's wedding to distract her, and without Tiffany's demands to anchor her fake reality, Barbara's meticulously curated image completely unraveled. The PTA mums from Oakbrook, who had always viewed her with a mixture of envy and suspicion, quickly caught wind of the bounced checks and the foreclosure notices taped to Brandon's condo door. In suburban circles, financial ruin is a contagious disease, and Barbara was instantly quarantined. Her real estate clients, sensing the desperation and hearing the whispers of fraud, dropped her one by one. Grandpa Theodore, however, was a pragmatic man. He despised Barbara, but he didn't want the family name, my father's name, dragged through a sordid, public criminal trial that would be printed in the local papers for years. He also knew that putting Barbara in a sterile prison cell wouldn't be half as agonizing for her as stripping away her status and her wealth. So Theodore made a brutal, ironclad deal. He met with the bank's legal team and offered to cover the immediate, outstanding deficit from his own personal, entirely separate retirement accounts to settle the fraudulent debt. He would make the bank whole, ensuring they wouldn't lose a dime. In exchange, they would drop the push for criminal prosecution. But Theodore's mercy came with a devastating price tag for Barbara. To keep herself out of a jail cell, she had to sign a legally binding agreement that completely severed her from the family trust. She relinquished her generous monthly stipend permanently. Furthermore, Theodore had his lawyers draft an absolute no-contact order. If she ever attempted to contact me, Caleb, or Lily again, the deal would be nullified, and Theodore would personally fund the revival of the fraud charges. She had no choice. She signed the papers in a bleak lawyer's office, weeping mascara-stained tears that garnered no sympathy from the men in the room. Without the trust's stipend to artificially inflate her income, Barbara could no longer afford her massive, sprawling house in Oak Brook. She was forced to put it on the market for a quick, devastatingly low cash sale, just to cover the mountain of credit card debt she had racked up for a wedding that never happened. But the absolute, most poetic stroke of karma didn't come from Theodore or the bank. It came from the very person Barbara had destroyed her life to protect. Brandon. When the bank finalized the foreclosure on the condo and the locks were changed, Brandon was forced to move his designer clothes and expensive gaming consoles into Barbara's newly rented, cramped two-bedroom apartment on the less desirable side of town. The golden child, suddenly stripped of his luxury lifestyle, his wealthy fiancé, and his endless stream of easy money, turned entirely vicious. He didn't see his mother's sacrifice. He only saw her failure. According to Theodore, who heard the neighborhood gossip through his old business connections, Brandon and Barbara fought constantly. Their screaming matches rattled the thin walls of her cheap apartment complex. Brandon blamed her entirely for Tiffany leaving him, claiming Barbara was too stupid to manage the money properly and had ruined his life. The toxic enmeshment they had shared, built entirely on financial dependency and mutual narcissism, finally imploded under the weight of actual reality. 6 months after the car crash, Brandon packed up his car in the middle of the night, drained the last $2,000 from Barbara's only remaining joint checking account, and moved to Florida with some old college buddies. He changed his phone number. He didn't say goodbye. He simply discarded her, just as easily as she had tried to discard me and my newborn daughter in the ICU. Barbara was left utterly and completely alone, working long hours at a mid-level commercial real estate firm just to pay rent. Stripped of her golden child, her luxury, and her scapegoat, the throne she had built from lies had burned to ash. As for me, my healing was slow but incredibly profound. The human body is a miraculous thing, but the human spirit is even more resilient. I spent 4 months in intensive physical therapy. There were days when the pain in my pelvis was so sharp I wanted to give up. But then I would look at Lily. She was growing stronger every day, her premature lungs expanding, her dark eyes tracking my movements across the room. She was my living, breathing reminder of what I was fighting for. Caleb was my rock, carrying the weight of our household, his job, and my care without a single complaint. And Grandpa Theodore became a permanent fixture in our lives. He sold his lake cabin and bought a small, beautiful ranch house just 3 miles from our neighborhood so he could see Lily every day. One crisp autumn afternoon, almost a year to the day since the accident, I achieved my final, silent victory. I was standing in the center of our living room. Caleb was sitting on the sofa, holding his breath, his eyes wide. Grandpa Theodore was leaning against the doorframe, a rare, soft smile playing on his weathered face. I let go of my silver walking cane. It clattered to the hardwood floor. I took a deep breath, braced my healed pelvis, and took one solid, independent step forward. Then another, and another. I walked completely unassisted across the room, reaching into the playpen, and scooped Lily up into my arms. I held her tight against my chest, feeling her tiny hands grasp the fabric of my shirt, entirely pain-free. I had survived the crash. I had survived my mother. I was standing on my own 2 feet, holding my future in my arms. Grandpa Theodore walked over and placed a heavy, warm hand on my shoulder. "I updated the trust today, Jessie," he murmured quietly, looking down at his great-granddaughter. "Everything your father left behind, everything that was salvaged, it's locked away in an ironclad, generation-skipping trust. It belongs to Lily now. No one can ever touch it. The cycle is broken." I leaned my head against his shoulder, tears of genuine, unburdened happiness spilling over my eyelashes. "Thank you, Grandpa, for everything. You did the hard part, kid," he replied softly. "You built a real family. In the end, my mother traded her daughter and granddaughter for a dress fitting and a golden child who bled her dry. I walked away with the only family that truly mattered, Caleb, Lily, and Grandpa Theodore. Karma didn't just knock on Barbara's door, it leveled her entire house. Sometimes, the most beautiful chapters of your life begin the exact moment you let the toxic ones burn to the ground.